The dawn was fragile, like spun glass, casting a pale, silvery glow across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. A solitary fog clung to the courtyard, curling around the wrought iron gates and damp cobblestones. In the hush before the palace awoke, a single figure moved with measured precision, each step on the marble echoing like a whispered warning. Guard Commander Edward Mallory, third-generation protector of the royal family, adjusted the crisp shoulder of his ceremonial uniform and exhaled through the cold morning air. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a stoic presence against the looming structure of the palace, and his eyes, a steely gray, swept over the empty hallways with the vigilance born of decades of service. Edward's boots clicked against the polished floor of the grand hall, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to merge with the echoes of history itself. Portraits of kings and queens watched silently from gilded frames, their painted eyes observing, judging, yet offering no counsel. The tapestries hung heavy with the weight of centuries, depicting battles, coronations, and alliances that had shaped the nation. The scent of wax polish mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of morning tea left in the silver trays from the night before. Every detail of the palace, the light filtering through stained glass, the distant clatter of carriage wheels on gravel was meticulously catalogued by Edward's senses. Today, like every day, his path would take him past the king's private chambers. The door, a towering slab of oak with brass fittings, gleamed under the muted sunlight. It was a door few were permitted to cross, a threshold separating the monarch's secrets from the eyes of the world. Edward had passed it 1,000 times, never pausing longer than protocol allowed. Yet, this morning carried an unusual weight. Perhaps it was the unusual chill that had settled in the East Wing, or the rare absence of the usual morning bustle. Something in the stillness pricked at Edward's instincts. He traced the pattern of his key with practiced fingers, checking locks and bolts as he proceeded. Security was his life, not merely duty. He was born into this vocation. His father had served King Charles III before him, and his grandfather before that, all sworn to protect the royal lineage with unyielding loyalty. Edward had learned early that the palace was not merely stone and mortar, it was a living entity, a web of whispered orders, concealed corridors, and unspoken hierarchies. Each guard's step, each servant's gesture, could ripple outward, unseen but consequential. As he walked toward the East Wing, the echoes of his boots mingled with the faint murmur of the household staff beginning their day. Maids' soft slippers brushed against rugs. The distant clink of silver hinted at breakfast preparations in the private suites. Edward's eyes, trained to notice everything, caught the subtle movements in the hallway, a flicker of a shadow, a curtain trembling, a door closing too quietly. Nothing seemed overtly wrong, but instinct told him to remain alert. He paused briefly outside the antechamber leading to the king's private quarters. The hallway was dim, lit by narrow windows that let in fragmented light. The polished parquet floor reflected the slender beams, and Edward's own silhouette stretched long and angular against the walls. He straightened his uniform once more, adjusted his ceremonial sword, and drew in a measured breath. Here, at the edge of the king's sanctuary, the air always felt heavier, as if centuries of decisions, alliances, and betrayals hung unseen. Edward's thoughts wandered to the royal family he served. King Charles III, a man of authority and tradition, ruled not only with protocol but with the weight of history pressing upon him. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, had been visiting briefly, a strict figure of moral expectation, his presence a reminder of duty and consequence. Princess Anne, with her unwavering directness, had been overseeing the palace renovations and staffing schedules. Her gaze, Edward knew, could pierce a man's resolve with a single look. Even the younger royals, George and Charlotte, moved with the awareness of expectation, their laughter echoing faintly in the distance, a fragile counterpoint to the palace's solemnity. The corridors themselves seemed to sense the rising tension. Edward felt the familiar pull of a palace, almost alive, a living labyrinth of secrets. There were chambers closed to all but a select few, and Edward's duty had often brought him close to their threshold, yet never beyond. Today, however, there was a subtle difference in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible draft whispered from beneath the king's chamber door, carrying a hint of paper, old and perfumed. Edward's instincts prickled. Something was amiss. He adjusted the ceremonial strap across his chest, fingers brushing the cold metal of his insignia. The palace, in its endless splendor, was a place of ritual and repetition. Guards walked their posts with quiet discipline. Staff carried out routines as if choreographed by invisible hands. Yet the very stillness made the slightest irregularity feel magnified. Edward's gaze flicked to the intricate lock on the king's door. Its brass gleamed, untouched. Yet the faintest scratch in its surface caught his trained eye. Subtle, but meaningful. Edward's steps carried him further down the hall, toward the familiar spiral staircase that led to the king's inner sanctum. The wood creaked beneath his weight, a soft, confidential sound that seemed to speak directly to him. He thought of the countless hours he had spent patrolling these floors, walking in shadows, and listening not for gossip, but for threats. In a palace of grandeur, danger was never loud. It was quiet, patient, and insidious. As he neared the king's private door, Edward's mind lingered on loyalty and morality, the twin pillars of his life. A royal guard's duty was clear, yet never simple. Loyalty demanded vigilance, sometimes at the cost of personal comfort. Morality required judgment, even when orders conflicted with conscience. And in a palace with centuries of hidden correspondence, unsent letters, and forbidden archives, the line between obedience and righteousness blurred. The sound of faint footsteps drew Edward's attention, not his own nor any member of the usual staff. He stopped, ears straining. A soft rustle, the faint brush of silk against the polished floor. Whoever it was, they were careful, but curiosity or mischief was never entirely silent. Edward's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, not in threat but readiness. The palace, majestic yet fragile, demanded it. A shaft of morning light fell across the ornate rugs, illuminating the hallway with a golden haze. Dust motes danced lazily, and Edward could almost feel the weight of history pressing in on him. The quiet was almost unbearable, yet it was in this silence that the palace spoke its truth. Something hidden lay behind the king's private door, waiting. A secret, forbidden, potent enough to shake even the steadfast walls of Buckingham Palace. Edward took a deliberate step forward, boots clicking, echoing like a metronome in the vast corridor. His breath was slow, controlled. He glanced once more at the door, its surface polished to perfection, guarding the unknown beyond. The faintest hint of paper, of words yet unread, brushed against the edge of his perception. His instincts, honed by generations of service, whispered a warning. Not everything within these walls was as it seemed. For now, though, the palace remained calm. The air smelled of wax and cedar, of fresh linens and distant tea. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, painting golden streaks along the floor. Edward adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, mind alert. The first act of a long day had begun, yet beneath the calm, a subtle tremor of unease lingered. A storm of secrets, of hidden letters and forbidden correspondence, was waiting just beyond the king's private door. And the man sworn to protect the royal family would soon face a choice that could shatter the delicate balance of loyalty, morality, and duty. Edward took a final breath, steady and deliberate, before moving closer to the threshold. The palace, majestic, silent, and filled with history, held its breath with him. The calm, he knew, would not last. The palace remained cloaked in early morning quiet, yet the calm was already beginning to fray at the edges. Edward Mallory's boots had barely settled into the rhythm of his patrol when a faint noise caught his attention. It was almost imperceptible, a muffled shuffle, soft but deliberate, coming from a corridor to his left. He froze mid-step, listening intently, the polished floor beneath his feet reflecting his tense silhouette. Edward's eyes narrowed, scanning the hall. No one should be here at this hour. The staff moved in choreographed precision, each servant attending to their assigned duties, and the young royals were still upstairs in their chambers, shielded from the world by both walls and protocol. Yet there it was again, a whisper of movement, deliberate, almost conspiratorial. The guard's hand instinctively brushed against the hilt of his ceremonial sword, not yet unsheathing it, but ready to act. He proceeded cautiously toward the sound, every step measured. The corridor was lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs, eyes frozen in painted judgment. The carpets muffled his movement, but the faint creak of a floorboard betrayed that someone else had passed moments before. Edward's breath was quiet, controlled, his ears straining for any additional hints. At the far end of the hallway, near a side door marked as an entrance to the minor offices of palace aides, Edward noticed a flicker of movement too swift to be the cleaning staff, too furtive to be any known household member. He slowed, observing the subtle sway of a uniform sleeve disappearing behind the door. Curiosity merged with instinct. Something was being done in secret. Edward's mind raced through possibilities. A delivery? A misplaced package? Or worse, a breach of security? His instincts whispered that this was no ordinary disturbance. With careful steps, he approached the door, noting the faint scent of ink and parchment wafting from beneath it. A subtle, yet unmistakable clue, the smell of written words, old and potent, stirred something in his memory. He had encountered forbidden correspondence before, during discreet inspections of palace archives, and the aroma was unmistakable. He reached the door silently and pressed his ear against its polished wood. A soft murmur of voices met him. Not a conversation, exactly, but the urgent shuffling of papers, the occasional low hiss of a cautionary word, and then silence, then the sound resumed. Edward's pulse quickened. His hand hovered over the door, ready to open it, yet he hesitated. He could not yet be certain of the risk. The palace demanded discretion, above all else. One wrong move could unravel far more than a simple intrusion. Stepping back slightly, Edward allowed his gaze to sweep the corridor again. Morning light filtered in from tall windows, casting elongated shadows along the floor. The haze of sunlight did little to calm the unease creeping up his spine. In the silence, he thought of the royal family. King Charles III's trust, Prince William's scrutiny, Princess Anne's piercing judgment. They weighed heavily on him. To misstep now could jeopardize not just his duty, but the very sanctity of the royal household. He made a slow, deliberate decision to observe before intervening. Edward backed into a shadowed recess of the hall, the polished floor beneath him whispering his caution. He needed to identify the source of the disturbance without alerting whoever was inside the office. Through the crack of the door, Edward glimpsed the figure of a young aide, barely older than a teenager, hunched over a small stack of papers. Her uniform was immaculate, but her posture betrayed haste and anxiety. The delicate movements of her hands folding, unfolding, rifling spoke of urgency. Edward recognized the ritual. She was handling documents meant to be hidden. The same instinct that had served his family for generations flared. Before he could consider action, another presence emerged, slightly taller, more assured. The second figure's identity sent a chill through Edward. A palace advisor, known for their discretion, yet notorious for navigating the shadows of power. Their movements were precise, almost choreographed, as they took a small leather-bound folder from the aide and whispered instructions, gesturing toward the king's private chambers. Edward caught fragments of their words. Must remain unseen. Before His Majesty notices. Destroy any trace. Edward's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary delivery. No misplaced file. The tone, the secrecy, the urgency it was, the language of forbidden matters. The kind that could ripple across the palace and beyond. He knew immediately that the documents were of consequence, dangerous even, and that exposure could have severe consequences for the young aide. Her fear was evident, trembling in subtle ways, the tightening of her shoulders, the quick glance over her shoulder, the soft bite of her lip. Edward felt the first stirrings of protective instinct. The quiet clink of metal on wood drew his attention. The aide had placed a small key onto the folder, a key Edward recognized. It belonged to the king's private chambers. The implication was immediate and alarming. Whoever held these letters intended to access the king's personal quarters without permission. A violation of trust, of security, of everything the palace represented. Edward considered the next step carefully. Intervention could expose him and the aide, but inaction was equally dangerous. The palace had seen scandals before. and whispers of secrets lost or stolen could haunt even the most loyal guard. His oath to protect the royal family now demanded a higher level of vigilance, balancing the immediate threat with long-term consequences. The aide paused, glancing toward the corridor. Edward's shadow stretched across the floor, yet he remained perfectly still, blending with the dim light. His presence was unnoticed, but it added tension to the room, a silent, unseen sentinel. He could feel the pulse of the palace quicken, the air seeming to hum with anticipation. Suddenly, a soft footstep echoed from the far end of the corridor. Another guard? No. The rhythm was different, lighter, less practiced. A child's laughter, barely audible, floated down the hallway. Edward's chest tightened. George and Charlotte were supposed to be safely upstairs. He squinted down the corridor, calculating their probable location. The young aide's eyes widened slightly, as if she, too, had heard it. Edward's instincts flared. The proximity of the children added a new urgency. Whoever was moving these letters was not considering the safety of the innocents within the palace. His duty, his moral compass, demanded immediate vigilance. He could not yet act overtly, but he had to anticipate. The aide and the advisor could make a misstep. A fall of papers, a misplaced key, a stumble it could expose them and endanger the children. Edward shifted imperceptibly, adjusting his stance to move faster if needed, while maintaining his concealment. His mind catalogued possibilities. Confront the aide now, or wait for a critical moment when the letters could be secured without alarming anyone. Every second felt like an eternity. The palace's silence had grown thick, expectant, as if even the walls were holding their breath. A faint click echoed metal against metal, subtle yet deliberate. The key had been inserted into a small drawer in the office desk, the movement precise, controlled, almost ritualistic. Edward's pulse surged. The forbidden letters were now within reach of someone who would misuse them. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension nearly tangible. He knew what he had to do. Remain hidden for now. Observe. Anticipate the exact moment when action was required. The palace had taught him patience, and history had proven that patience could save lives and legacies alike. Yet, with every heartbeat, the danger escalated, and Edward felt the quiet tremor of fear, not for himself, but for the innocent lives and sacred duties he was sworn to protect. Outside, sunlight continued to filter through the palace windows, casting patterns on the floor that seemed almost ceremonial, a reminder of the grandeur at stake. And in the shadows, Edward Mallory, loyal guard of 3 generations, prepared for the unseen confrontation that would soon threaten the sanctity of the king's private chambers. Something forbidden was moving through the palace, and Edward could feel the tremor of its potential consequences. He waited, silent, unseen, ready. The calm of Buckingham Palace had been breached, and the first threads of intrigue were beginning to unravel. The palace seemed to hold its breath, the corridor silent except for Edward Mallory's careful footsteps, blending with the distant echo of distant servants preparing for the day. Yet the calm of the morning had fractured completely. Behind the closed door of the minor office, tension thickened like storm clouds waiting to burst. The young aide's hands shook slightly as she folded the forbidden letters, her brow damp with the sheen of apprehension. The advisor, tall, deliberate, and shadowed in the dim light, watched her every move, their expression unreadable but precise, authority masked by secrecy. Edward's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision before him. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room for any hint of misstep. This was no ordinary infraction. Whoever was orchestrating this had full knowledge of the king's private chambers, the exact route to bypass notice, and the key to unlock the door. It was audacious, calculated, and dangerous. The air inside seemed to vibrate with unspoken malice. Then, as if summoned by the tension itself, the corridor outside the office door creaked slightly lighter than a step, but deliberate. Edward froze, instinct screaming. The sound of small, careful footsteps carried toward the king's private chambers. Someone else was entering the fray. The assistant moved slightly, their hands twitching with nerves as they glanced at the door. Edward recognized the signs immediately: hesitation, fear, but also loyalty to the wrong cause. Through the sliver of space between door and frame, Edward's eyes caught the figure who now appeared Prince William, the Prince of Wales, standing in full regalia for an early ceremonial review. His face, usually composed and controlled, was rigid with authority, eyes sharp as flint. His gaze swept the room like a hawk, stopping short at the advisor and the aide. There was no mistaking it. William had perceived something irregular, and his patience was already thinning. "Explain yourself." Prince William's voice was low but commanding, carrying the precise measure of danger and authority. Every word echoed across the room, resonant with moral weight. The aide flinched, instinctively stepping back, the letters trembling in her grasp. The advisor, however, remained calm, though a subtle tightening of the jaw betrayed hidden tension. Edward could see the calculations behind their eyes. Every word measured, every gesture meant to redirect blame, to mislead. The Prince of Wales advanced, slow and deliberate. "These papers," he said, his gaze piercing, "are not to leave this room, yet here they are, in your hands. Do you understand the gravity of this?" The advisor attempted to speak, but the words faltered, clipped, defensive, failing to mask the urgency of their concealment. The aide's eyes widened, panic rising like a tide she could not hold back. Edward's decision solidified. Action was required. He could not yet reveal himself. William's intervention might trigger chaos, but he could prepare, anticipate the next moves. The stakes had escalated. Innocence and secrecy hung in balance, threatened by ambition and misjudgment. Edward's mind catalogued possibilities. Interception, protection of the letters, safeguarding the children, and ensuring no unintended disaster for the king. The advisor's voice, measured but edged with tension, finally broke the silence. "Your Highness, these are routine correspondences," they claimed, their tone smooth, practiced, but faltering. Nothing of consequence, merely administrative matters overlooked. The words, though calm, lacked authenticity. Edward recognized the lie immediately. The weight, the smell of old ink, the ritual of secrecy, it all signaled a hidden truth, a forbidden element that could ripple throughout the palace. Prince William's gaze hardened, focusing on the aide. "Do not test me," he said sharply, the moral weight of his authority cutting through the room like a sword. "The king's private chambers are sacred. You place everyone at risk. You know this." The aide swallowed, tears welling, but the advisor remained defiant, calculating, a shadow playing across their features. Edward's mind raced. He could intervene now swiftly, silently, but any overt action might be misinterpreted as disobedience or escalation. Instead, he chose the patient, tactical approach, observing every micro-expression, every twitch of hesitation, every trace of guilt or fear. The palace had taught him that patience could prevent disaster, even in the presence of danger and deception. Then came a subtle movement, a faint shuffle of papers, a slip of a hand. Edward's gaze caught it instantly. One of the forbidden letters had fallen to the floor, a single sheet exposed, revealing glimpses of tightly written script. The words themselves were indecipherable at first glance, but the signature at the bottom sent a shiver through Edward's spine. These letters were not mere correspondence. They were orders, instructions, secret alliances, and possibly evidence of misconduct at the highest level. The moral stakes now became undeniable. Prince William noticed the sheet as well, his eyes narrowing further. "This is serious," he said, his voice a dangerous blend of authority and disbelief. "Do you understand what you hold? The implications for the king, for the family, for the palace itself." The aide shook violently, trying to gather the remaining letters, while the advisor remained eerily composed, the calm facade masking the tension of imminent exposure. Edward took a careful step closer, still hidden, his mind calculating the next move. He realized the moral dilemma in full force. He could act openly and risk the confrontation escalating beyond control, or he could wait, gather all necessary information, and ensure that the truth was protected while shielding the innocent. His oath to protect the royal family, to uphold loyalty, demanded both courage and restraint. The aide, sensing the escalating scrutiny, finally whispered, I was told to—" Her voice faltered, a tremor betraying the weight of forced compliance. The advisor placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure yet inadvertently highlighting the pressure. Edward's instincts screamed. The young aide, innocent yet compromised, needed protection, but the letters themselves were far too important to leave vulnerable. Prince William's patience was thinning. "No excuses," he said firmly, his eyes sharp as blades. "You will account for every action. The king will decide the consequences, and they will be severe. Understand?" The words carried the finality of royal authority. Edward could see the fear in the aide's eyes, a mirror of his own rising tension. At that moment, a shadow fell across the corridor outside the silhouette of a figure arriving unnoticed, silent yet foreboding. Edward recognized the approach instantly. Princess Anne, authoritative and direct, entering with the precision that marked every decision she made. Her presence added another layer of pressure. She was known for her uncompromising sense of order and her unflinching moral judgment. She paused at the doorway, observing, calculating. Her eyes flicked between the aide, the advisor, and Prince William, registering every expression, every movement, every falter in composure. "Explain this disruption," Princess Anne demanded, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "I will not tolerate incompetence, deceit, or interference in the king's private matters. Every action here is under scrutiny, and I expect full transparency." The aide trembled visibly, caught between fear, loyalty, and guilt. Edward's pulse quickened. The moment of confrontation had arrived, and yet the resolution was far from clear. The moral and ethical stakes had now reached a fever pitch. Forbidden letters in the hands of the wrong people, royal authority confronted, innocence threatened, and Edward's duty as protector extending beyond protocol into the domain of moral judgment. Every heartbeat carried the weight of impending revelation. Every breath a tension-laden anticipation of what was to come. The palace, for all its grandeur, had become a pressure cooker of secrets, loyalties, and hidden truths. Edward's hand rested lightly on his ceremonial sword. He was ready. The moment demanded courage, discernment, and moral clarity. In the shadows, he watched, calculating, preparing to act in the instant when duty and conscience intersected with opportunity. The forbidden letters were no longer just documents, they were catalysts, capable of shaking the palace to its core, and the first cracks in the facade of order were already visible. The young aide's gaze flicked toward Edward, sensing a silent ally. The advisors stiffened, calculating risk and exposure. Prince William's authority weighed down on the room, a moral hammer of judgment and expectation. And Princess Anne, poised and unyielding, added pressure from a third angle. Edward knew that one wrong move, one misstep, and the consequences could cascade beyond imagination. The first act of confrontation had begun, and the palace itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Behind the closed door, decisions would be made. Loyalties would be tested, morality would be measured against duty, and Edward Mallory, the third-generation guardian of the royal family, was poised to navigate the storm, knowing that the outcome would reshape the morning, perhaps the palace itself. The tension inside the room was nearly tangible, a dense fog of fear, authority, and secrets pressing on every figure. Edward Mallory remained in the shadows, every sense alert, every muscle poised for action. The young aide trembled, clutching the forbidden letters as if they were both a shield and a burden too heavy to bear. The advisor's calm, deliberate movements were now edged with unease, betraying a mind calculating every potential misstep. Prince William's eyes were flint, unwavering in their scrutiny, and Princess Anne's presence added an electric charge of moral authority. Edward knew the next moments could define the day, perhaps even alter the balance of trust within the palace. He moved imperceptibly, just enough to catch the movement of hands, the tilt of heads, the shift of bodies. The letters, the catalyst of all this upheaval, lay between the aide and the advisor, a silent fulcrum of potential catastrophe. The advisor spoke first, voice smooth but sharp. "Your Highness, I assure you, this is not what it appears to be. The letters, yes, they are from the king, but they are merely private communications. Matters of protocol that require discretion, nothing malicious, nothing to alarm you." Their words were meant to soothe, but Edward detected the undercurrent of defensiveness, the subtle tension beneath the carefully measured tones. Prince William's gaze did not waver. "Discretion?" he said, voice heavy with authority. The only discretion here has been violated. The very act of moving these documents without permission is a betrayal. Do you not understand the gravity of interfering with the king's private affairs? His eyes locked on the advisor, unwavering, a quiet storm of moral judgment and royal expectation. Princess Anne stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. We cannot allow ambiguity here. Either the letters are harmless, in which case they remain in their proper place, or they contain information that demands intervention. I will not allow this palace to be compromised through negligence or manipulation. Her piercing gaze swept the room, assessing every twitch, every sign of deception. Edward could feel her authority radiating, weighing on the shoulders of all present. The young aide, tears brimming, whispered, I was told to bring them here. I didn't know what they contained. Her voice trembled, carrying both innocence and fear. Edward's jaw tightened. He recognized the truth of her words' complicity without comprehension, but the potential consequences of her actions were nonetheless severe. A sudden movement in the corner drew Edward's attention. One of the letters had slipped from the aide's grasp, fluttering to the floor with a whisper of paper against wood. Edward's trained eyes caught the title written in an unmistakable hand, partially obscured. For His Majesty's eyes only. A chill ran down his spine. These were not mere correspondences, they were private communications, potentially explosive if mishandled, perhaps even damning. Prince William's hand dropped decisively onto the aide's shoulder. You will not touch another document until this matter is resolved, he said, voice firm, measured, yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of fury. The aide flinched, biting back a sob. The weight of authority pressed down, the consequences of disobedience hanging like a blade above her head. Edward's gaze flicked to the advisor, who had shifted slightly, the shadow of uncertainty flitting across their features. The advisor's fingers hovered over the letters, as if to reclaim control, but Edward's instincts screamed caution. One wrong move, and the letters could be lost, destroyed, or misinterpreted, plunging the palace into scandal. The corridor outside grew alive with faint echoes. Footsteps slow, deliberate approached the office, carrying with them the unmistakable rhythm of another royal presence. Edward tensed, recognizing the unmistakable gait of King Charles III himself. His authority was absolute, his attention unforgiving. The letters, if revealed now, could provoke immediate consequences. Edward's mind raced. Conceal, intercept, or reveal. Each choice carried weighty ramifications. The king entered, his presence commanding and immediate. What is happening here? His voice, deep and resonant, cut through the tension like a sword. The advisor straightened, offering a polite bow, while Prince William's posture remained rigid, unwavering. The young aide shrank slightly, as if hoping to disappear entirely beneath the gravity of the king's gaze. Edward remained in the shadows, heart steady, mind calculating. Charles's eyes scanned the room, sharp and precise, lingering on the letters that lay exposed. Explain, he demanded, his tone both regal and urgent. Edward felt the room's energy shift. The moment for measured observation had passed. The king's presence brought the stakes into full clarity. Secrets, loyalty, and duty now intersected in a delicate, potentially explosive balance. The advisor spoke, voice smooth but strained. Your Majesty, these are letters intended for your private attention. They were moved without authorization. Yes, but for reasons of immediate necessity, security, and preservation. Their eyes flicked to Edward, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the silent guardian who had remained in the shadows. Prince William's eyes blazed. Moved without authorization? Your Highness, the very act of removing these letters is a breach of trust. We cannot tolerate this. His hand gestured to the documents. The content, though unknown to me, could be of critical consequence. We must act now to secure them and ensure no further interference. Edward's instincts urged precision. He stepped slightly forward, his voice calm, deliberate. Your Majesty, with your permission, I can ensure the letters are secured immediately. They will be returned to your private chambers without further disturbance, and any potential compromise will be prevented. His words carried the weight of his duty, the calm authority of someone trained to act decisively. Yet, with prudence, the king's gaze flicked to him, Assessing. Edward held steady, every fiber of his being aligned with the oath he had inherited from generations of service. The aide's hands shook visibly, the advisor's composure faltering under the weight of scrutiny. The royal children's earlier presence in the palace, though still distant, added an invisible layer of urgency to the situation. The letters could not fall into the wrong hands. Not now, not ever. Charles's voice cut through the tension, calm yet commanding. Secure the letters. Ensure no further disturbance. I will review them myself. This palace cannot be compromised by negligence or ambition. The command was absolute. Edward nodded subtly, already calculating the safest method to retrieve the letters without further exposure. As Edward moved to intercept the papers, a sudden, almost imperceptible sound drew his attention, the creak of a side door opening. His hand froze on the first letter. Through the crack of the doorway, the shadow of another figure appeared. Princess Charlotte, tiny and determined, peeking cautiously around the edge of the hall. Edward's chest tightened. The presence of a child in a room charged with authority, secrecy, and potential scandal was a complication he had not anticipated. Charlotte's wide eyes scanned the room. She seemed unaware of the gravity of the situation, but her innocence was starkly exposed against the tension around her. Edward's pulse quickened. The moral stakes had reached their zenith. Protect the letters, uphold duty, and shield the child. Every instinct honed over decades flared with urgency. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between Charlotte and the exposed documents. The aide's eyes met his, a silent plea for protection. The advisor's composure snapped briefly, a flicker of impatience or realization passing across their features. Prince William's jaw tightened, sensing Edward's calculated move, while Princess Anne's gaze cut through him with silent evaluation. The king observed all, weighing every action, every hesitation, every glance. Edward knew the next moments would define the outcome. Intervention had become imperative. The letters, the moral choices, the royal authority, and the protection of the innocent were now intertwined. The palace itself seemed to pulse, as if anticipating the climax of this escalating drama. Every heartbeat, every breath, every movement was magnified, fraught with consequence. Then, a sudden rustle, a sound, small but significant, echoed from the advisor's direction. Edward's hand tightened on the letters, ready to intercept. The room held its breath. The balance of power, loyalty, and innocence teetered on a knife edge, and Edward Mallory, loyal guardian of 3 generations, prepared for the decisive moment that would determine the day and perhaps the fate of the palace itself. The room seemed to shrink around Edward Mallory as he positioned himself between Princess Charlotte and the forbidden letters. Every heartbeat resonated through his chest like the echo of a distant bell. Time, which had felt suspended during the morning's tension, now accelerated, compressed into sharp, deliberate moments. The aide trembled visibly, their innocence and fear mirrored in the wide eyes of the child, while the advisor's composure was visibly cracking, tiny cracks forming in a facade meant to mask ambition and secrecy. Edward's hand rested lightly on the topmost letter, the paper warm and fragile under his touch. Every instinct honed over decades of service demanded precision. A wrong move could unravel everything. The letters could fall into unintended hands. The king's trust could be broken, and the child could be endangered. He inhaled a deep, measured breath and allowed himself a fraction of clarity amidst the rising storm. Prince William's gaze swept over Edward, the aide, the advisor, and Charlotte in sequence. "This cannot escalate further," he said, his voice sharp yet controlled. "Edward, do you have the situation under control?" There was a subtle undercurrent in his tone, a recognition of Edward's skill, his discretion, and his unwavering loyalty. The responsibility now rested squarely on Edward's shoulders, a convergence of duty, morality, and courage. Edward nodded subtly. "Yes, Your Highness. The letters will be secured, and the child protected. No further risk will come to the royal family." His words, though calm, carried the gravity of absolute commitment. Every person in the room seemed to register the weight of the statement. The aide's fingers relaxed slightly. The advisor's jaw clenched, and Charlotte blinked up at Edward with trust and innocent curiosity. Edward moved decisively, reaching for the letters with controlled precision. His movements were silent, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He lifted each one carefully, ensuring none were bent, torn, or otherwise compromised. The advisor attempted to intervene, a flicker of desperation flashing in their eyes, but Edward's gaze met theirs with quiet authority. One motion, a gentle but firm gesture, halted any further interference. The tension hung thick in the air, palpable, like the still moment before a thunderclap. Princess Anne's heels clicked sharply as she stepped closer, observing Edward's actions with a mixture of approval and scrutiny. "Ensure nothing is lost, Edward," she said, her voice commanding yet tinged with subtle encouragement. "The king's trust, the palace's order, and the safety of the young ones depend on it. Remember that." Her gaze swept over the aide and the advisor, a silent admonition layered with unyielding authority. Edward, aware of every movement around him, now had the letters in his possession. His mind catalogued the next steps with meticulous precision. Secure the letters in the king's private chambers, confirm no copy or duplicate had been made, and ensure the young aide was not implicated further than necessary. The palace was alive with tension, but he moved with the composure of a seasoned guardian. Each step calculated, each breath controlled. Prince William shifted slightly, eyes never leaving Edward. "We cannot allow breaches like this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not in my father's house. Not ever." The words were heavy with authority and the weight of familial duty. Edward sensed the underlying threat. One misstep could ignite a scandal, yet one precise intervention could preserve loyalty, dignity, and the fragile balance of power. Edward moved toward the king's private chambers, the letters secure in his hands. The aide followed at a careful distance, guided by subtle gestures and unspoken instructions. The advisor lingered, hesitation etched into every line of their face. Edward could feel their calculation, their mind racing for an opportunity. Yet he was prepared. Every instinct, every lesson passed down through generations, converged in this single moment of responsibility. As they approached the heavy oak door to the king's chambers, Edward's hand rested on the brass handle. A faint chill passed through the corridor, the morning light shifting to cast long, angular shadows across the polished floor. He glanced briefly at Princess Charlotte, who now peeked from behind a corner, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of trust and curiosity. The weight of innocence added urgency to every move he made. Edward opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking faintly, a sound magnified in the charged silence. The private chambers were bathed in muted sunlight, dust motes suspended in the air like tiny golden specters. The desk, polished to perfection, awaited the letters, a repository of secrets and history. Edward placed each document carefully, ensuring the king's private correspondence remained intact, untouched, and secure. The aide exhaled softly, relief threading through her posture. Edward's gaze flicked to the advisor, who had retreated slightly, their expression unreadable, but now tinged with the first hints of concern. Edward knew their ambitions would not vanish overnight, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. The palace's fragile equilibrium, for now, had been restored. Outside the chambers, the voices of the royal children drifted faintly. Laughter carried along the corridors. Edward's heart softened at the reminder of what he was protecting, not just letters, not just protocol, but the innocence and continuity of the family he had sworn to guard. Princess Charlotte's tiny footsteps drew closer. She paused at the doorway, eyes wide, curiosity still flickering but tempered by Edward's calm authority. Edward knelt slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. "Stay close," he whispered softly, his tone carrying warmth without diminishing the weight of the day's events. Charlotte nodded, trust evident in her small, deliberate gesture. The aide, observing this interaction, seemed to absorb a measure of calm, a reminder that loyalty, guidance, and protection were tangible, living forces within the palace walls. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible click echoed from the far corridor. Edward's senses, honed over decades, tensed instantly. He turned sharply, scanning the hall. The sound was subtle, deliberate, the presence of another, moving with intent. His hand instinctively rested on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, fingers lightly brushing the cool metal. The palace, ever alive with secrets, had not yet finished revealing its twists. Prince William's voice cut through the charged silence, calm yet precise. Edward, you see to the letters and the child. I will address the advisor. Ensure the king is aware. His eyes, resolute, flick toward the retreating figure of the advisor, who now seemed to understand the gravity of their position. Edward nodded, acknowledging the instruction, eyes scanning the corridor once more. Princess Anne's gaze met his, a silent communication passing between guardian and moral arbiter. She gave a subtle nod, recognition of his judgment, his calm authority, and his ability to act decisively under pressure. Edward understood. This was not a final resolution, only a temporary balance. The palace had survived the morning's turbulence, but the undercurrents of intrigue and ambition were far from dormant. Edward secured the letters within the king's chambers, placing them carefully in a hidden compartment beneath the desk, a safeguard known only to him and a select few. He double-checked locks, ensuring that only those with the highest authority could access the documents. The moral and practical victory was his, but he remained vigilant. Every sense was alert. Every instinct was primed for the next challenge. As Edward emerged from the private chambers, he noticed a shadow moving quickly down a corridor, a figure unseen until now, retreating into the palace's hidden recesses. The movement was deliberate, urgent, almost conspiratorial. Edward's pulse quickened. The palace, majestic and historic, had more stories waiting, more secrets to reveal. Today's confrontation had been averted, but the consequences would ripple outward, touching those both loyal and ambitious. The king, Prince William, and Princess Anne would convene shortly to review the letters, each aware of the delicate balance maintained. Edward returned to the corridor where Charlotte had remained, guiding her gently, ensuring her path remained safe. The aide followed, still pale, still trembling, but now tempered by relief and the subtle reassurance of Edward's presence. As Edward led the child and aide toward the morning's resumed routines, a quiet tension remained in the air. The forbidden letters had been secured, but Edward knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. The palace walls held centuries of secrets. Ambitions were never fully quelled. Loyalty was constantly tested. One wrong whisper, one hidden gesture, and the equilibrium could shatter once more. Edward's eyes scanned the corridor, alert for any sign of movement, any whisper of a plan unfolding unseen. He understood fully. The palace had survived today, but tomorrow could bring new challenges, new threats, and new secrets waiting to emerge. His duty was far from over, and in the shadows of Buckingham Palace, as the morning sun rose higher, Edward Mallory's hand lingered over the hidden compartment containing the forbidden letters. The weight of history, duty, and morality pressed upon him, and a single thought crystallized in his mind. The palace was secure, for now. But secrets, like shadows, have a way of surfacing when least expected, and Edward knew, with the certainty of a guardian who had seen decades of intrigue, that the next storm was already gathering just beyond the palace walls.